Commander Zarthik stepped off the transport shuttle and felt Earth's gravity pull at his body. It was heavier than his home world, but not uncomfortably so. He had been to many planets during his 30 years of military service, and Earth seemed pleasant enough. The sky was blue. The air was breathable without assistance, and the temperature was mild. Nothing about this world suggested danger. He was a decorated officer of the Galactic Coalition, a military alliance that spanned 300 star systems. His species, the Koth-Arii, were known for their discipline and tactical precision. He had fought in 12 different conflicts and earned medals for valor and strategic thinking. The Coalition had chosen him for this mission because of his experience and his ability to evaluate military capabilities with an objective eye. His mission was simple. He would spend 1 week observing the United States Military Academy at West Point. He would watch their training methods, study their tactical doctrine, and write a report for the Coalition. This was part of a cultural exchange program designed to build trust between humanity and the other species of the galaxy. Humans had joined the Coalition only 50 years ago, and many species still did not understand them well. Zarthik had studied human military history before his arrival. What he found was predictable. Humans had spent most of their existence fighting each other over resources, territory, and ideology. They had developed increasingly destructive weapons and had nearly destroyed themselves several times with nuclear warfare. Their history was written in blood, much like many other species during their pre-spaceflight era. It was nothing remarkable. The Coalition had helped humanity move past their violent phase. They had been given access to advanced technology, medical knowledge, and the opportunity to join a peaceful galactic community. Most humans had embraced this new era with enthusiasm. They served in Coalition fleets as engineers, scientists, and support personnel. They were friendly, curious, and eager to learn. A woman in a military uniform approached him. She was shorter than Zarthik, with gray hair cut close to her head and sharp eyes that studied him carefully. Her uniform was covered with ribbons and medals that indicated high rank and extensive service. "Commander Zarthik, welcome to West Point. I am General Patricia Hughes, the superintendent of this academy." She extended her hand in the human gesture of greeting. Zarthik took her hand carefully. His species was naturally stronger than humans, and he had been warned not to grip too hard. "I am honored to be here, General. Thank you for hosting me." 2 other humans stood beside the general. One was a tall man with broad shoulders and a stern face. The other was a young woman with alert eyes and a ready smile. General Hughes introduced them. "This is Colonel Kevin Brooks, our head of tactical training. And this is Lieutenant Amy Carter. She will be your guide during your stay." Zarthik greeted them both. Lieutenant Carter would accompany him throughout the week, answering his questions and explaining what he observed. She seemed competent and professional. He found himself relaxing slightly. This assignment would be straightforward. They walked through the academy grounds. The buildings were made of stone and brick, solid and imposing. Monuments stood everywhere, commemorating battles and honoring dead soldiers. Zarthik noted the names and dates carved into metal and stone. Humans seemed to value their military traditions deeply. Many species did. It was a way of maintaining continuity and teaching lessons to new generations. Cadets marched in formation across a wide parade ground. They moved with precision, their boots striking the pavement in unison. Zarthik observed their discipline and noted it approvingly. Proper formation drills were essential for any military. They taught coordination, timing, and the ability to move as a unit. "How many cadets train here?" Zarthik asked Lieutenant Carter. "Approximately 4,000, she replied. "They spend 4 years here, learning military science, engineering, leadership, and tactical doctrine. When they graduate, they become officers in the United States Army." 4 years seemed like a long time for basic military training. In the Coalition, most soldiers completed their training in 18 months. But humans were still developing their military traditions. Perhaps they needed extra time to learn what came naturally to species with longer martial histories. Lieutenant Carter led him to a building near the training grounds. Inside, she showed him to a comfortable observation room with large windows overlooking several practice areas. "You can watch the training from here," she explained. "We have screens that will show you other areas of the academy as well. I will be nearby if you have questions." Zarthik settled into a chair and activated his datapad. He would take detailed notes and record his observations. The Coalition wanted a thorough report, and he intended to provide one. He expected to see basic combat training, tactical exercises, and physical conditioning. Standard, military preparation for a ground-based force. Through the window, he could see cadets assembling for an afternoon training session. They wore matching gray uniforms and moved with purpose. Instructors in different uniforms stood watching them, occasionally calling out orders or corrections. Everything looked orderly and professional. Lieutenant Carter brought him a drink of water and pointed out some of the key training areas. "Tomorrow morning, you will observe our physical conditioning program. In the afternoon, tactical simulations. The following days will cover survival training, psychological preparation, and combat readiness exercises." Psychological preparation caught his attention. "What does that involve?" he asked. "Teaching cadets how to handle stress, fear, and difficult decisions under pressure," Carter explained. "Military leadership requires mental strength as much as physical capability." That made sense. The Coalition had similar programs, though they were usually brief. Most species developed psychological resilience naturally through experience. Still, it was good that humans recognized the importance of mental preparation. That evening, Zarthik reviewed his notes and prepared questions for the following day. He felt satisfied with his first day. The academy seemed professional and well organized. The humans were respectful and eager to demonstrate their training methods. He anticipated a week of interesting but unremarkable observations. He opened his datapad and began his preliminary report. Day 1. Initial impressions positive. Human Military Academy maintains strong discipline and clear organizational structure. Cadets appear motivated and well-led. Training philosophy seems conventional, focused on basic military skills and leadership development. No significant concerns identified. As he prepared for sleep, Zarthik thought about the cadets he had seen marching across the parade ground. They had looked young and eager, fresh-faced and enthusiastic. They reminded him of young soldiers from every species, full of energy and idealism. Not yet tested by the harsh realities of military service, he wondered how many of them would actually see combat. Probably very few. The galaxy had been at peace for 2 centuries. The Coalition maintained military forces primarily for peacekeeping and disaster response. Most soldiers served their entire careers without ever facing an actual enemy. It was a good thing. War was wasteful and destructive. Tomorrow, he would begin his detailed observations. He would watch these young humans train, take his notes, and write his report. Then he would return home, file his documents with Coalition Command, and move on to his next assignment. It would be a pleasant week. Nothing more. Zarthik had no way of knowing that everything he believed about human military training was wrong. He had no idea that the next 6 days would challenge every assumption he held about warfare, soldier development, and the nature of humanity itself. He could not imagine that by the end of the week, he would file a report that would send shockwaves through Coalition Command and change how every species in the galaxy viewed their human allies. But that knowledge would come soon enough. For now, he slept peacefully, unaware of the revelations that awaited him. The alarm in Zarthik's quarters sounded before dawn. He checked the time and felt confused. His schedule indicated that training observations would begin at 0800 hours. But it was barely 0500. Perhaps there had been an error in the schedule Lieutenant Carter had provided. He dressed and made his way to the training grounds anyway. Better to arrive early than miss something important. As he approached, he was surprised to see cadets already assembled in the darkness. Their breath created small clouds in the cold air. The temperature had dropped significantly during the night, and frost covered the grass. Lieutenant Carter stood near the observation area, holding 2 cups of coffee. She handed one to Zarthik. "Good morning, Commander. I hope you got enough sleep." 3. "Why are the cadets assembled so early?" Zarthik asked. "And in such cold conditions?" "This is our annual endurance trial," Carter explained. "It is a tradition here. The cadets will complete a series of physical challenges over the next 12 hours. We start early, so they finish before dark. 12 hours of physical training." Zarthik made a note on his datapad. In the coalition military, physical conditioning sessions typically lasted 90 minutes to 2 hours. Longer sessions were considered inefficient and potentially harmful. Soldiers needed to conserve their energy for actual combat operations. Exhausting them during training served no purpose. "Is this not dangerous?" Zarthik asked. 12 hours is an extremely long time for continuous physical activity. Carter smiled slightly. "They get short breaks between events, and we have medical personnel standing by. But yes, it is demanding. That is the point." As the sky began to lighten, an instructor called the cadets to attention. There were approximately 50 of them, both male and female, all wearing identical gray training uniforms. They looked nervous but determined. The instructor explained the day's schedule. A 2-mile run, followed immediately by push-ups and pull-ups, then a 6-mile forced march with heavy packs, then an obstacle course, and more challenges after that. The run began. The cadets sprinted away from the assembly area, their feet pounding the frozen ground. Zarthik watched through binoculars as they ran. Even from a distance, he could see the effort on their faces. This was not a comfortable pace. They were pushing themselves hard. When they returned 20 minutes later, many were breathing heavily. Some looked like they might vomit. But the instructor immediately ordered them to begin push-ups. No rest period. No time to recover. Just straight into the next challenge. Zarthik watched a female cadet named Megan Sullivan struggle through her push-ups. Her arms shook with effort. Sweat dripped from her face despite the cold. She completed 30 push-ups, then 40, then 50. Her form was breaking down, her body clearly reaching its limits, but she continued. When she finally finished her set, she collapsed onto the ground, chest heaving. "Should they not rest between exercises?" Zarthik asked Lieutenant Carter. "This is an endurance trial," Carter replied. "Rest is not part of it. They need to learn how to keep functioning, even when they are exhausted." After push-ups came pull-ups. Then the cadets shouldered heavy packs and began their march. Zarthik noted the weight of the packs. Each one appeared to weigh at least 20 kilograms, perhaps more. The cadets staggered slightly as they lifted them onto their backs. The march took them across rough terrain, up hills, and through wooded areas. Zarthik and Lieutenant Carter followed in a vehicle, observing from a distance. Through the vehicle's monitors, Zarthik could see individual cadets struggling. Some fell behind the main group. Others stumbled on rocks or tree roots. But they all kept moving. 4 hours into the trial, the cadets reached the obstacle course. They had been exercising continuously for 4 hours. They were soaked with sweat. Their faces were red from exertion. Several were limping from blisters or minor injuries. But there was no rest period. The instructor simply directed them to begin the obstacle course. Zarthik watched in growing disbelief. The obstacle course was brutal. High walls to climb, deep mud pits to crawl through, rope climbs, and sections where cadets had to crawl under barbed wire while instructors sprayed them with cold water. This was not training. This was torture. A male cadet named Ryan Foster attempted to climb one of the high walls. He jumped, caught the top edge, and tried to pull himself up, but his arms, exhausted from hours of exercise, could not support his weight. He fell backward, landing hard on the ground. Zarthik saw him grimace in pain and clutch his ankle. "He is injured," Zarthik said, standing up. "Medical assistance should be provided immediately." Lieutenant Carter spoke into her radio, but her voice was calm. "Medical is monitoring. If he calls for help, they will respond." But Ryan Foster did not call for help. He stood up, tested his injured ankle, and limped toward the next obstacle. His face was twisted with pain, but he kept moving. He threw himself into the mud pit and began crawling forward, his injured leg dragging behind him. "Why does he not stop?" Zarthik demanded. "He is clearly hurt. He can stop any time he wants," Carter said. "But he chooses not to. He wants to complete the trial." Other cadets passed Ryan Foster as he crawled through the mud. They did not stop to help him. Each cadet was focused on their own challenge, their own pain, their own determination to finish. When Ryan finally emerged from the mud pit, covered in filth and clearly suffering, he simply moved to the next obstacle. Zarthik felt something cold settle in his chest. In coalition military training, an injured soldier would be immediately removed from exercise and treated. The health and safety of soldiers was paramount. Allowing someone to continue training with an injury was not just foolish, it was barbaric. It risked permanent damage. It served no logical military purpose. But these humans did not seem to care about logic. They pushed forward, as if pain was simply another obstacle to overcome. As if their bodies' warning signals were things to be ignored rather than heeded. By hour 6, 3 cadets had vomited from exhaustion. Zarthik watched in horror as they vomited, wiped their mouths, and continued exercising. By hour 8, several cadets were openly crying. Tears ran down their faces as they forced their bodies through movements that should have been impossible. Their muscles were failing. Their energy was depleted. But they did not stop. Megan Sullivan, who Zarthik had been watching periodically throughout the day, was in terrible condition. She could barely walk. Her legs shook with every step, but when the instructor ordered the cadets to run another mile, she ran. Her pace was slow, more of a shuffling jog than a real run, but she moved forward. "This is cruel," Zarthik said quietly. Lieutenant Carter turned to look at him. Her expression was serious. "No, Commander. We are showing them that they are stronger than they think. Every person has a point where they believe they cannot continue. We push them past that point. We teach them that their mind will quit long before their body actually fails. This lesson could save their lives someday." Hour 10 arrived. More than half the cadets were moving like walking wounded. They stumbled, fell, caught themselves, and kept going. Some were talking to themselves, maintaining focus through sheer willpower. Others moved in silence, their faces blank, masks of determination. 3 cadets finally collapsed. Their bodies simply stopped functioning. They lay on the ground, conscious but unable to stand. Medical personnel rushed to them with water and monitoring equipment. These 3 would not finish the trial, but the other 47 cadets continued. When the 12 hours finally ended, they stood in formation one last time, swaying with exhaustion but still standing. The instructor congratulated them. They had passed the endurance trial. They had proven something to themselves and to their academy. Zarthik walked back to his quarters in silence. Lieutenant Carter accompanied him, but neither spoke. His mind was trying to process what he had witnessed. In one day, he had seen young humans pushed to the absolute limits of physical endurance. He had seen them continue past the point where their bodies were screaming at them to stop. He had seen them vomit and cry and bleed and still keep moving. In coalition training, physical limits were respected. Soldiers were taught to fight efficiently, to conserve their energy, to know when to rest and recover. The idea of pushing past physical limits was considered dangerous and counterproductive. An exhausted soldier was a liability, not an asset. But these humans were teaching their soldiers something different. They were teaching them that limits were things to be overcome, that pain was temporary, that the body could be forced to continue long after the mind wanted to quit. That night, Zarthik sat in his quarters and stared at his datapad. He needed to update his report, but he did not know what to write. How could he explain what he had seen? How could he make the coalition understand that humans trained their soldiers to ignore their own bodies, to push past every natural warning signal, to treat physical suffering as simply another challenge to overcome? He thought about coalition soldiers facing human soldiers in combat. What would happen when a human soldier refused to stay down, refused to quit, refused to acknowledge that they were beaten? What kind of enemy kept fighting even when their body was failing? Zarthik finally typed a single sentence into his report. Human endurance training raises significant questions about combat persistence and psychological resilience. Further observation required. It was inadequate, but it was all he could manage. Tomorrow would bring new observations, new shocks, new revelations about what humans were truly capable of, and Zarthik was beginning to fear what else he might discover. On the third day, Lieutenant Carter led Zarthik to a large building near the center of the academy. "Today you will observe our tactical simulation center," she explained. "This is where cadets learn combat strategy and practice making decisions under pressure." Zarthik felt relieved. After the disturbing physical training of the previous day, he looked forward to observing something more familiar. Strategy and tactics were universal concepts. Every military force in the galaxy trained their officers in these fundamentals. Here, at least, he expected to see doctrine that made sense. Colonel Kevin Brooks met them in the simulation control room. The room was filled with monitors and computers that displayed virtual battlefields. Below, through large windows, Zarthik could see cadets seated at individual stations, each with their own screen and controls. "Welcome, Commander," Brooks said, shaking his hand. "Today our cadets will run several combat scenarios. They will command small units in various tactical situations. We have programmed realistic enemy forces with standard military doctrine." "What doctrine do the enemy forces follow?" Zarthik asked. "We use coalition military doctrine," Brooks replied. "Since humanity is part of the coalition, it makes sense for our cadets to understand how coalition forces think and operate. We obtained the tactical programming from coalition military databases with proper authorization." Zarthik nodded. This was reasonable. Understanding your allies' tactical thinking was important for coordination during joint operations. He settled into his observation seat. Datapad ready. Finally, something that would make sense. The first scenario began. 8 cadets were assigned to defend a fortified position against a larger enemy force. The scenario parameters appeared on the main display. The cadets had good defensive positions, adequate ammunition, and clear fields of fire. The enemy force was approximately 30 units. Approaching from the east, Zarthik watched as the cadets set up their defenses. They positioned their units to cover all approaches, established overlapping fields of fire, and prepared to hold their ground. This was textbook defensive doctrine, exactly what any competent officer would do. He began to relax. The enemy forces attacked. The cadets opened fire, inflicting casualties. The enemy advanced, using proper tactical movement, using cover, and coordinating their approach. Everything was proceeding according to standard military theory. The defenders would hold their position, inflict maximum casualties, and eventually force the enemy to withdraw or call for reinforcements. Then, 4 minutes into the engagement, the squad leader made a decision that made no sense whatsoever. Split formation, the squad leader, a male cadet named Greg Palmer, ordered. "Chris, take 3 units and draw them left. We will hit their rear." Zarthik leaned forward, certain he had misheard. But no. The cadets were abandoning their fortified position. Half the squad was running directly toward the enemy, firing as they moved, while the other half circled around to the side. They had given up their defensive advantage, divided their already outnumbered force, and were now attacking an enemy that outnumbered them nearly 4-1. "What is he doing?" Zarthik asked Colonel Brooks. "He has abandoned a superior position to attack from a position of weakness. This violates basic tactical principles." Brooks smiled. "Watch what happens." The enemy AI responded exactly as Zarthik expected. It adjusted to the new threat, began to reposition forces to counter the flanking movement, and prepared to crush the divided human forces with superior numbers. This was going to be a disaster. But it was not a disaster. The human cadets, attacking aggressively and moving unpredictably, created chaos in the enemy formation. The enemy AI, programmed with standard coalition doctrine, expected the humans to defend their position. When the humans instead attacked, the AI's response was momentarily confused. That moment of confusion was all the humans needed. The flanking force hit the enemy from the side. The frontal force pushed hard against the enemy center. Caught between two attacks and unable to properly respond to the aggressive, seemingly reckless human tactics, the enemy formation collapsed. Within 3 minutes, the scenario was over. Victory for the humans. Zarthik stared at the screen in disbelief. "They did," Brooks confirmed. "Aggressive action, speed, and unpredictability. Those are core principles of human tactical doctrine. We teach our cadets that the best defense is often a good offense. Never let the enemy dictate the terms of engagement." The next scenario was even more disturbing. The cadets were assigned a mission to capture an enemy strong point. The parameters were harsh: limited ammunition, no heavy weapons, and the enemy position was well fortified with multiple defensive layers. In coalition military doctrine, this would be classified as an impossible mission. You would request artillery support, airstrikes, or heavy armor. Without those assets, you would not attempt the mission at all. The squad leader studied the scenario for less than a minute. Then she began giving orders. Her name was Lisa Monroe, and she had a calculating look in her eyes that made Zarthik uncomfortable. "We are going to make them think we have mortars," Lisa said to her squad. What followed was a demonstration of deception that shocked Zarthik to his core. The cadets used their limited explosives to create blasts that simulated mortar fire, but at irregular intervals and in patterns that suggested multiple mortar teams. They broadcast false radio communications about incoming artillery support, using military terminology and realistic delivery. They created fake movement in areas where the enemy could observe them, suggesting a much larger force than they actually had. The enemy AI analyzed the situation. Multiple mortar teams. Artillery support en route. Large infantry force maneuvering for attack. Based on this analysis, the AI made the logical decision. It began to withdraw from the strong point to avoid being trapped by superior forces. As the enemy withdrew, the human cadets simply walked into the abandoned strong point and claimed victory. They had won without firing more than a dozen shots. They had achieved their objective through pure deception. "That was lying," Zarthik said flatly. "They won by making the enemy believe something false." Colonel Brooks looked at him with genuine confusion. "Yes, that is correct. Deception is one of our most valuable tactical tools. Making the enemy believe false information gives us a significant advantage. Why would we not use it? Is it not dishonorable?" Zarthik asked. "Dishonorable?" Brooks shook his head. "Commander, in war, there is no dishonor in using every advantage available. The only dishonor is in losing when you could have won. If we can achieve our objective without casualties through clever deception, that is the best possible outcome." Arning. The Duning. Intassen. Arning. Scenario after scenario unfolded before Zarthik's eyes, and each one challenged his understanding of military doctrine. Human cadets divided their forces when they should have concentrated them. They attacked when they should have defended. They retreated only to suddenly turn and attack from an unexpected direction. They used terrain in creative ways, turned environmental conditions to their advantage, and employed psychological tactics that bordered on cruel. In one scenario, a squad was ordered to delay a larger enemy force. Coalition doctrine would have them establish a defensive position, fight for a specific amount of time, then conduct an organized retreat. Simple and predictable. The human cadets instead set up a series of ambush points. They would fire from one position, then retreat before the enemy could respond, then set up at another position, and repeat the process. They made noise in one area to draw attention while moving silently in another. They left false trails that led the enemy into dead ends. They turned the entire battlefield into a confusing maze where the enemy never knew where the next attack would come from. The enemy force, larger and better equipped, became frustrated and disorganized. They began making mistakes, taking unnecessary risks, and eventually suffered far more casualties than they should have. The human squad successfully delayed them for twice as long as required, using tactics that were infuriating and seemingly illogical. But they worked. Every single time, they worked. Zarthik reviewed coalition military records during a break. He accessed battle reports from humanity's integration into the coalition. There had been incidents. Minor conflicts where human forces had resisted coalition authority before the integration was complete. Guerrilla actions that had lasted for years in some regions. Human defenders who had turned entire cities into nightmares of ambushes and traps. At the time, Coalition Command had attributed these actions to desperate rebels, fighting with whatever tactics they could manage. But now, watching these cadets, Zarthik realized the truth. Those had not been desperate rebels. Those had been trained soldiers fighting exactly as they had been taught. The humans had tactics for fighting from a position of weakness. They had doctrine for turning disadvantages into advantages. They had training for scenarios where they were outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. And in every case, their tactics involved being unpredictable, aggressive, and willing to do things that other species would never consider. "Why do you teach such unusual tactics?" Zarthik asked Colonel Brooks during the afternoon break. Coalition military doctrine is based on centuries of warfare across hundreds of species. It represents proven strategies that work. Brooks poured himself coffee and considered the question. Coalition doctrine works very well for coalition species, he said. But humans are different. We evolved on a planet where we were not the strongest predator. We survived through intelligence, adaptability, and the willingness to try anything that might work. Those traits carried over into our military thinking. He gestured to the simulation floor below, where cadets were preparing for another scenario. We teach our cadets that there is no single correct answer to any tactical problem. Rules can be broken if breaking them leads to victory. Conventional wisdom can be ignored if ignoring it gives you an advantage. The only thing that matters is achieving your objective. But without rules and doctrine, you have chaos, Zarthik protested. Military forces require discipline and structure. We have plenty of discipline, Brooks replied. We want officers who can think creatively, who can adapt to changing situations, who can look at an impossible problem and find a solution anyway. That requires teaching them to question assumptions and think beyond standard doctrine. That evening, Zarthik sat in his quarters and tried to write his report. But how could he explain what he had seen? How could he make Coalition Command understand that human tactical doctrine was built on principles that violated everything they had been taught? Coalition forces fought with honor, following established rules of engagement and proven tactical methods. They expected their enemies to do the same. But humans fought to win, using any method that worked, respecting no traditions except their own. In a conflict between coalition forces and human forces, who would prevail? Coalition forces had superior technology and numbers, but humans had unpredictability, aggression, and a willingness to break every rule if it led to victory. Zarthik typed slowly. Human tactical doctrine represents a fundamental departure from coalition military theory. Their approach to warfare is adaptive, aggressive, and deeply unconventional. Further analysis strongly recommended. He paused, then added one more line. Recommend all coalition tactical AIs be updated to account for non-standard human decision-making patterns. Tomorrow would bring new observations. Zarthik was no longer certain he wanted to see them. Each day revealed something new about humanity, and each revelation was more unsettling than the last. Lieutenant Carter arrived at Zarthik's quarters early on the fourth morning. Her expression was more serious than usual. "Today will be difficult to observe," she said quietly. "What you will see may seem harsh, but I ask that you reserve judgment until you understand the purpose." Zarthik felt a chill of apprehension. The past 3 days had already shown him things that challenged his understanding of military training. What could be worse than what he had already witnessed? They drove to a building set apart from the main academy campus. It was surrounded by fences and had minimal windows. Guards checked their identification before allowing them to enter. Inside, the building was stark and utilitarian. Plain walls, harsh lighting, and an atmosphere that felt deliberately oppressive. "This is where we conduct SEER training," Carter explained. "Survival, evasion, resistance, and escape. It teaches cadets how to survive if they are captured by enemy forces." "Resistance?" Zarthik asked. "Resistance to what?" Carter met his eyes. "To interrogation and captivity. We need to prepare our soldiers for the possibility of being held prisoner by hostile forces. They need to know what it feels like, and they need to learn how to maintain their sanity and their loyalty under extreme duress." She led him to an observation room. Below, visible through one-way glass, were a series of small cells. In those cells, cadets sat in various states of discomfort. Some stood in stress positions with their arms extended. Others sat in rooms where loud music played continuously at volumes that must be painful. Still, others were confined to spaces so small they could barely move. "What is the purpose of this?" Zarthik asked, though part of him already knew. His voice sounded hollow even to himself. "We need to simulate what captured soldiers might experience," Carter said. "Enemy forces might use sleep deprivation, stress positions, sensory manipulation, isolation, and psychological pressure to break prisoners. Our soldiers need to experience these things in a controlled environment, so they know how to resist if it happens in reality." Zarthik watched a male cadet named Kyle Henderson being led into an interrogation room. The cadet looked tired and stressed. He sat in a chair, and an instructor began questioning him. The questions were aggressive and relentless. Who was his commanding officer? What were his unit's plans? Where were the weapons stored? Kyle answered with only 3 pieces of information: his name, his rank, and his serial number. Over and over, no matter what the instructor asked, he gave the same response. His voice was steady at first, but as minutes turned into hours, it began to crack. The instructor changed tactics. He became friendly, offering Kyle water, and promising that if he just answered a few simple questions, the session would end. He could rest, eat, and be comfortable. All he had to do was cooperate. Kyle repeated his name, rank, and serial number. The instructor became angry, shouting at Kyle, accusing him of betraying his fellow soldiers, telling him that everyone else had already talked, and he was the only one being stubborn. The psychological pressure was intense, designed to create doubt, fear, and the overwhelming desire to make the discomfort stop. Kyle's hands shook. Sweat dripped down his face. His eyes were red, and his voice was hoarse. But he continued to repeat his name, rank, and serial number with mechanical precision. "How long does this continue?" Zarthik asked. "This phase lasts 48 hours, Carter replied. "Then we teach them advanced resistance techniques, and then we put them through the simulation again, so they can practice what they learned. 48 hours. Zarthik felt sick. In coalition military doctrine, soldiers were taught that if capture was likely, they should surrender peacefully. If interrogated, they should provide basic information to avoid harm. The idea of resisting interrogation was considered pointless. Professional interrogators would eventually extract information from any prisoner. Making soldiers suffer needlessly served no purpose. But humans were training their soldiers to resist, to endure psychological torture without breaking, to treat mental anguish as just another obstacle to overcome. In another cell, visible on a monitor, a female cadet named Nicole Parker sat alone in complete darkness. No light, no sound, no human contact. According to the display, she had been there for 20 hours. Isolation, Zarthik knew, was one of the most psychologically damaging experiences a sentient being could endure. Social species like humans needed interaction with others. Extended isolation could cause permanent mental damage. He watched Nicole through infrared cameras. She paced the tiny cell, counting her steps aloud. Then she sat and performed exercises. Then she sang songs to herself. Her voice barely audible. She was fighting desperately to maintain her grip on sanity, using every mental trick she could think of to keep her mind active and functional. This will harm them, Zarthik said. Psychological trauma, from experiences like this, can last a lifetime. You are damaging these young soldiers. Carter turned to him, and her expression was hard. These cadets volunteer for this training. They know what they are signing up for. And yes, it is difficult. But we are not damaging them, we are preparing them. She gestured to the monitors. If one of our soldiers is captured by a hostile force, they might face far worse than what we show them here. They might be held for months or years. They might be tortured. They might be subjected to psychological manipulation designed to turn them against their own country. We need to know that they can survive it, that they can maintain their discipline and their hope even in the darkest circumstances. Zarthik watched Kyle Henderson continue his interrogation. 4 hours had passed. The cadet was visibly breaking down. His responses were slower, his voice weaker, but he had not broken. He continued to resist, continued to refuse to provide any information beyond his name, rank, and serial number. What happens if they break? Zarthik asked. If they provide false information or confess to things they did not do, then we teach them why they broke and how to resist better next time, Carter replied. This is training. We want them to learn from their experiences. Some cadets do break during their first session, but they learn from it, and they become stronger. On another monitor, a male cadet was being subjected to what the display called sensory manipulation. He sat in a chair while lights flashed in irregular patterns and discordant sounds played at varying volumes. The combination was designed to create maximum psychological discomfort without physical harm. The cadet's face showed his distress, but he remained in his chair, enduring the experience. Zarthik thought about coalition soldiers. They were trained for combat, for following orders, for working as part of a cohesive unit. They were good soldiers by any reasonable standard, but they were not trained for this. If coalition soldiers were captured and subjected to sustained interrogation and psychological pressure, most would break within days. It was not a moral failing. It was simply reality. Resisting professional interrogation required preparation that most species did not provide. But humans provided that preparation. They subjected their own soldiers to controlled versions of the worst experiences they might face, teaching them through direct experience how to endure and resist. The afternoon brought new observations. Zarthik watched cadets practice escape techniques, learning how to pick locks, exploit security weaknesses, and survive with minimal resources. They were taught to view captivity not as an end but as a temporary situation that could be escaped with patience and cleverness. They were shown videos of propaganda that prisoners might be forced to create, learning how to include subtle signals that would indicate they were speaking under duress. They practiced communication methods that could be used while under surveillance, using codes and gestures invisible to untrained observers. Every aspect of the training assumed that capture was not the end of a soldier's usefulness. Even as prisoners, They could resist, gather intelligence, and look for opportunities to escape and return to their units. That evening, Lieutenant Carter showed Zarthik the results of previous SERI training classes. The data was startling. Cadets who completed SERI training showed increased resilience to stress in all areas of their military service. They had lower rates of psychological breakdown during combat. They demonstrated stronger bonds with their fellow soldiers. They showed higher rates of mission completion under adverse conditions. "You are forging them," Zarthik said quietly. "You put them through psychological trauma, and they emerge stronger." "Yes," Carter agreed. "That is exactly what we are doing. We show them the worst that could happen, and we teach them that they can survive it. When they face real hardship in the field, they have a reference point. They know they have endured worse in training." Zarthik returned to his quarters and sat in silence for a long time. What he had witnessed went beyond military training. It was a systematic process of psychological conditioning designed to create soldiers who could not be broken through normal means. Coalition military forces were professional and effective, but they were not prepared for enemies who had been conditioned to view suffering as temporary, who saw psychological manipulation as just another challenge to overcome, who refused to break no matter how much pressure was applied. He thought about the young cadets he had observed. They had been afraid, clearly suffering, pushed to the edge of their psychological limits, but they had endured, and they would carry those experiences with them forever, knowing that they had faced darkness and survived. What kind of species did this to their own children? And more importantly, what kind of soldiers did this process create? Zarthik typed his report with shaking hands. Human military training includes systematic psychological conditioning that would be considered unacceptable by coalition standards. However, results indicate this training creates soldiers with exceptional mental resilience and resistance to interrogation. Implications for coalition security protocols require immediate review. He paused, then added a personal note. Recommend coalition forces never engage in sustained conflicts against human military forces. Human soldiers are conditioned to endure conditions that would break most other species. Standard interrogation and detention procedures will be ineffective. Tomorrow was his last full day at the academy. General Hughes had invited him to her office for a final discussion. Zarthik both anticipated and dreaded that conversation. He had learned so much about humanity over the past 4 days. He was no longer certain he wanted to know more. On the 5th and final day, General Patricia Hughes invited Zarthik to her office. The office was large and comfortable, with windows overlooking the academy grounds. The walls were covered with photographs, military medals, and historical artifacts from centuries of human warfare. Books lined shelves on every wall, their titles covering topics from ancient military history to modern strategic theory. General Hughes gestured to a comfortable chair and poured 2 glasses of amber liquid. "This is whiskey," she explained. "A traditional human drink. I thought we should speak honestly today. And whiskey helps with honest conversations." Zarthik accepted the glass carefully. He had consumed human alcohol before during diplomatic functions. It was stronger than most coalition beverages, but not unpleasant. He took a small sip and felt the warmth spread through his body. "You have questions?" General Hughes said. It was not a question but a statement. She settled into her own chair and studied him with those sharp, knowing eyes. Zarthik did have questions. Hundreds of them. But he voiced the most important one. The question that had been building in his mind over the past 4 days. Why? Own one. Why do you train your soldiers this way? The physical extremes that ignore the body's limits. The tactical doctrine that breaks every conventional rule. The psychological conditioning that subjects young soldiers to controlled trauma. It seems designed to create soldiers who are unstable, unpredictable, and dangerous. Thanks for watching. Endoculated. General Hughes took a long drink of her whiskey. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful and measured. Let me tell you something about human history. Commander, our planet, Earth, is what we call a death world. It has killed more humans than all our wars combined. Predators, diseases, natural disasters, famines, and climate extremes. For most of our existence, simply surviving to adulthood was a significant achievement. She stood and walked to a map of Earth hanging on her wall. We evolved as one predator among many. We were not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most well-armed by nature. We survived through persistence, intelligence, and the absolute refusal to give up. When a prey animal ran, we followed it until it collapsed from exhaustion. When we faced a stronger predator, we used tools, cooperation, and creativity to overcome it. Zarthik listened, beginning to understand but still disturbed by the implications. We did not develop advanced technology through peaceful cooperation like most species, Hughes continued. We developed it through constant competition and conflict. Humans have been fighting each other for thousands of years. Every military doctrine we have was written in blood. Every tactic we teach was developed because someone found a way to kill us, and we had to adapt or die. She returned to her chair and refilled both glasses. You asked why we train our soldiers to ignore physical limits. It is because humans are persistence hunters. We evolved to keep moving when every other species would stop. Our ancient ancestors would track prey animals for days, never stopping, never resting, until the prey literally died of exhaustion. That trait is still in us. We can push our bodies further than most species, because we evolved to do exactly that. Zarthik thought about Megan Sullivan limping through the obstacle course on an injured leg, about Ryan Foster crawling through mud with a damaged ankle. He had thought they were being foolish, ignoring their body's warning signals. But Hughes was suggesting it was something deeper, something written into human genetics. You asked why we use unconventional tactics, Hughes said. It is because we learned, over thousands of years of warfare, that the side that follows predictable patterns loses. We study our enemies, we learn their doctrines, and then we do things they do not expect. We teach our officers that rules are guidelines, not absolutes. If breaking a rule leads to victory, then break it. She leaned forward, her expression intense. Do you know what happens when two human armies fight each other? Both sides are using unpredictable tactics. Both sides are adapting constantly. Both sides are trying to outthink the other. The result is chaos, innovation, and incredibly high casualties. We learned to fight this way because we had to. Our enemies were other humans, and humans do not fight fair. Zarthik felt a chill run through his body. The coalition had been at peace for 2 centuries. Their military doctrine was designed for peacekeeping operations and defense against minor threats, but humans had been fighting each other continuously until very recently. Their doctrine was forged in constant warfare against enemies who thought exactly like them. You asked about our psychological training, Hughes continued. About SARE and the conditioning we put our soldiers through. Let me be very clear about this. We do not do it because we are cruel. We do it because we know what real cruelty looks like. Human history is filled with examples of soldiers who were captured, tortured, and broken. We studied those cases. We learned what methods were most effective at breaking prisoners. And then, we subjected our own soldiers to controlled versions of those methods, teaching them how to resist. End of it. She pulled up a file on her computer and turned the screen toward Zarthik. It showed historical records from Earth's past. Soldiers who had been held as prisoners for years, subjected to torture and psychological manipulation, yet had maintained their discipline and loyalty. Their accounts were horrifying. They had endured things that should have destroyed their minds. But they had survived. These soldiers survived because they were prepared, Hughes explained. They had been through SARE training. They knew what to expect. They had mental techniques for maintaining hope and sanity. Without that training, they would have broken within weeks. But with it, they endured for years and came home with their honor intact. Zarthik stared at the records. Some of these prisoners had been held for 5 years, 10 years, even longer. They had been subjected to starvation, beatings, isolation, and psychological torture. Yet they had maintained military discipline, supported their fellow prisoners, and resisted their captors' attempts to extract useful information. "You are proud of this," Zarthik said quietly. "Proud?" Hughes considered the word. "No, Commander, but realistic, yes. We know what we are. We are a species that evolved on a death world, that spent thousands of years fighting each other, that learned to turn suffering into strength and defeat into lessons. We are not the most advanced species in the galaxy. We are not the strongest or the smartest, but we are survivors." She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the cadets marching across the parade ground. "You came here to evaluate our military training. What you really saw was us preparing our children for the universe we live in. Because we learned, long ago, that the universe does not care if you are ready. It will hurt you, test you, and break you if it can. So we teach our soldiers to be unbreakable." Zarthik joined her at the window. The cadets looked so young from this distance, so small and fragile. But he knew the truth, now. They were being systematically prepared for extremes that most coalition soldiers would never face. They were being taught that pain was temporary, that limits could be overcome, and that surrender was never the only option. "The Galactic Coalition has been at peace for 2 centuries, Zarthik said slowly. "Our soldiers train for peacekeeping and defense. We expect our enemies to follow established rules of warfare. We treat prisoners humanely and expect the same treatment in return. But humans train for total war. We train for survival," Hughes corrected gently. "Whether that is against an enemy army, a hostile planet, or our own limitations. We teach our soldiers that there is always a way forward, even when everything seems lost. Especially when everything seems lost. That mindset has kept humanity alive for millions of years. We are not going to abandon it just because we joined a peaceful galactic community." She turned to face him directly. "You asked me once if deception in warfare was dishonorable. Let me answer that properly now. To humans, the only dishonor is in giving up when you still have options. We will lie, cheat, adapt, and improvise if that is what it takes to protect our people and complete our mission. We do not fight fair, Commander. We fight to win, and we accept no outcome except victory or death." Zarthik felt the weight of her words. This was not bravado or empty rhetoric. This was a statement of fundamental human philosophy, forged over millennia of constant struggle. Humans did not view warfare as a game with rules. They viewed it as survival. And in survival, anything was permitted. He thought about coalition military doctrine, built on centuries of relatively peaceful coexistence. The coalition had rules about acceptable weapons, treatment of prisoners, and limits on collateral damage. These rules were followed because all member species agreed they were civilized and proper. But what would happen if humanity faced an existential threat? Would they follow those rules? Or would they revert to their ancient instincts, using every weapon and tactic available, fighting with the desperate creativity of a species that had spent its entire existence struggling to survive? "I need to return to my ship tomorrow," Zarthik said. "I need to compile my report and present it to Coalition Command." "What will you tell them?" Hughes asked. Zarthik considered his answer carefully. "I will tell them the truth. That humanity's military training is more intensive, more extreme, and more psychologically demanding than any other species in the Coalition. That your tactical doctrine is unconventional to the point of appearing chaotic. That your soldiers are conditioned to endure hardships that would break most other species." He paused. "And I will recommend that the Coalition maintain strong diplomatic and military ties with humanity, because the alternative is too frightening to contemplate." Hughes smiled, but it was a sad smile. "You understand then? You see what we are. I see young soldiers being forged into something incredibly dangerous," Zarthik replied. "I see a species that turns weakness into strength, that refuses to accept defeat, that views every obstacle as a challenge to overcome. I see allies that I am grateful to have, and enemies that I pray we never face. That evening, Zarthik packed his belongings and compiled his final report. He wrote carefully, knowing that his words would be read by coalition military leaders and political officials across hundreds of worlds. He documented everything he had observed, but he tried to present it objectively, without the fear that had been growing in his chest all week. But as he wrote his final summary, he could not help but include a personal observation. Humanity represents a unique challenge for coalition military planning. Their training creates soldiers who are physically resilient beyond normal biological limits, tactically unpredictable in ways that standard military doctrine cannot easily counter, and psychologically conditioned to resist interrogation and maintain combat effectiveness under conditions that would incapacitate most other species. He continued typing, each word feeling heavier than the last. Most importantly, human military culture emphasizes victory at any cost and refuses to accept surrender as an option. This mindset, combined with their unconventional training methods, creates a military force that is far more dangerous than their relatively primitive technology would suggest. He added his final recommendation. It is imperative that humanity remain a coalition ally. Under no circumstances should the coalition take actions that would position humanity as an adversary. While human forces are currently small and their technology lags behind coalition standards, their training methods suggest they would prove extraordinarily difficult to defeat in sustained conflict. They do not fight to win battles. They fight to survive. And a species that views warfare as survival will use methods that other species would consider unthinkable. The next morning, Zarthik stood on the landing pad as his shuttle prepared for departure. General Hughes, Colonel Brooks, and Lieutenant Carter came to see him off. They shook hands, and Zarthik thanked them for their hospitality. As the shuttle lifted off, Zarthik looked down at the academy one last time. Cadets were running their morning formation, small figures moving across the grounds with precision. They looked so young, so ordinary, so human, but he knew what they would become. Those cadets would graduate and join human military forces across the galaxy. They would serve alongside coalition soldiers from dozens of species. Most would never see combat. They would have peaceful careers, complete their service, and return to civilian life. But if war came, those humans would fight with an intensity and determination that would shock the galaxy. They would endure conditions that broke other species. They would use tactics that seemed insane but worked anyway. They would refuse to surrender, refuse to quit, refuse to accept defeat until their last breath left their bodies. As his ship entered orbit and prepared to jump to faster-than-light travel, Zarthik transmitted his report to Coalition Command. He had done his duty. He had observed, documented, and reported. Now, it was up to others to decide what to do with this knowledge. But as the stars stretched into lines and his ship left Earth behind, Zarthik said a quiet prayer to his ancestors. He prayed that humanity would remain the Coalition's friend, because after 5 days at their military academy, he believed with absolute certainty that humans were the most dangerous soldiers in the galaxy. Not because they were strong, not because they were smart, but because they had been raised by a death world and trained by endless warfare to never stop, never quit, and never accept anything except complete victory. The Coalition called them allies. Zarthik prayed they would always remain so, because a humanity that turned those relentless, unbreakable warriors against the Coalition was a nightmare that would keep him awake for years to come.